القلق من إمكانية.
That's Hezbollah leader Syed Hassan Nasrallah, who addressed the public today for the first time since the October 7th attack by Hamas. Nasrallah warned the U.S. to halt Israel's aggression against Gaza. He said fighting on the Lebanese front could turn into a full-fledged war, but that depends, he says, on Israel's escalation in Gaza and towards Lebanon. Okay, we're going to turn to two Middle East analysts for more analysis on all of this. Rhonda Sleem is a senior fellow and director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program at the Middle East Institute. Thomas Junot is an associate professor at the University of Ottawa, specializing in the Middle East. Thank you both for joining me today. Rhonda, I wonder if we could start with your assessment of what we heard from Hezbollah today, warning the U.S. to be ready for all possibilities if Israel doesn't stop. That sounds like threatening rhetoric. What do you make of what Hezbollah and Nasrallah said today?
Well, I mean, what he said is that what's happening on the border between Lebanon and Israel, and has been happening for a while now, escalation, this escalatory spiral is here to stay. And it's going to be proportional. At one point, he enunciated, in my opinion, a new red line, which is when he said, you know, any civilian hit in Lebanon will be met by hits on civilian targets in Israel. So basically trying to reinforce old rules that, you know, the fight is between military to military, you know, fighters to fighters, let's spare the civilians. That's one. And the second point he tried to make, which is any kind of major escalation, regional conflagration, as far as Hezbollah is concerned, is dependent on what happens in Gaza. Now, what is the threshold they are looking? What is their threshold for escalation in Gaza that, in their mind, will trigger a regional conflagration? I don't know. Is it big mass casualty event? Is it new weapons? But definitely, in the past, I have said any attempt at destroying, eradicating Hamas is a red line for them. And as you said, the threat against the US, reminder very much of 1983. In fact, he made a specific reference to the early 1980s, to the 1983 attack on the Marine barracks in Beirut. And he said something which was really interesting and new. You know, it's when he said the people who were responsible for that attack are still alive today. You know, to my mind, this is like the first time that Hezbollah takes that kind of ownership of that attack.
Right.
You know, at the time, who did that attack was, you know, left a little bit confusing. But today he said the people who did the attack or who planned the attack are still alive today. So it's a clear threat to the United States and basically laid the blame on the United States for this war. He said, this is a U.S. war. This is not only Israel. This is a U.S. war.
So Thomas, you know, warning the United States, saying if Israel hits civilians, we'll hit civilians back, and sort of saying what happens in Gaza could determine their response. What does that say about Hezbollah's willingness and desire to maybe escalate what's happening in the region?
I would say that there was a message in Hezbollah's speech today that it prefers not to escalate. That obviously has to be caveated in many ways, but I find that the main takeaway from the speech as a whole was we would rather not have a full-blown war with Israel. I think that a number of observers have been predicting that was Hezbollah's preference. In the case of an escalation, Israeli retaliation on Lebanon would be absolutely devastating. The destruction on Lebanon would take years and probably decades to recover from. And this is something that Hezbollah probably wants to avoid. I mean, there's a bit of a deterrence, a very fragile deterrence, but a deterrence nonetheless between the two. And to some extent, there was a confirmation of that in Nasrallah's speech this morning. He did not give a complete blank check or green light on Israel to say, do whatever we want, we are not going to do anything. There was a clear message. There is somewhere a red line, but as Rhonda said, it is ambiguous exactly where it is. But to me, ultimately, the main takeaway was we would rather not escalate, but if we have to, we will, keeping in mind that it's not clear what that means.
Right. So Rhonda, something that jumped out at me in this, and tell me if it's important or not, he expressed support, I guess, for what Hamas did on October 7th, but made clear that the attackers were 100% Palestinian. basically saying it was not us, we had nothing to do with it. Is that significant? Am I correct in seizing on that?
That is significant. I mean, both Hezbollah and Iran have from the get-go been saying this is a Palestinian operation. I mean, he kept repeating, Nasrallah, this is all a Palestinian operation. And now, there is one thing about timing, not knowing the timing of the operation, but whether they knew, they knew of the planning, they knew. I mean, that kind of operation by Hamas was pulled based on experience that was accumulated by different members of the resistance axis, including Hezbollah's experience in Syria, including the Houthis' experience in Yemen, including the Iraqi militia's experience against the American. So the timing might have been unknown to all of them, including Hezbollah and Iran. But I doubt whether the planning, the training, which took a number of months, if not years, and definitely the weapons and the money for this, definitely they knew about that.
Right. So Tama, Antony Blinken in Israel again today, many trips to Israel over the course of this, supporting Israel's right to defend itself, but again pushing for humanitarian pauses. And with Prime Minister Netanyahu coming out and saying the ceasefire and pauses are really a non-starter until the hostages are released. How do you think this will play in the region as they try to keep a lid on this from spiraling?
So it appears that the U.S. strategy right now is what a lot of experts are calling the bear hug strategy. So trying to hug Israel as closely as possible with the idea that to be able to have some kind of influence on Israel, the rhetoric and the support has to be very warm. And that it is only by doing that that the U.S. will be able to have some tactical influence on Israel, in this case, to push it to exercise some limited restraint, including by allowing for humanitarian pauses. There's a very legitimate debate as to whether that's the best strategy for the U.S., but that seems to be the case for now. Will these humanitarian pauses work? I think there will be some, but I'm skeptical that there will be certainly not as much as the U.S. would want. Israel right now is not in a space where it is willing to negotiate at that level. There is, I wouldn't say consensus, but there is a lot of support throughout the spectrum in Israel for this operation to continue in opposition to a ceasefire. There's mounting criticism of Netanyahu on a number of things, and I think that will only escalate, but not on the issue of the ceasefire, certainly not for now. Regionally, this absolutely, as you were saying, puts the U.S. in a delicate position because a lot of the U.S.'s closest partners in the region, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, are themselves in a very vulnerable position. So I would expect that they will be pressuring the U.S. more and more as this continues.
So on that, Rhonda, the Secretary of State and the President and others have been calling for these humanitarian pauses, including in person today. And then within hours, Israel hits an ambulance outside Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City. Now, the IDF said they did it because the ambulance was being used to transport Hamas fighters. But how do you think a moment like this is looked at in the region by all the key players on the other side?
It's looked at with a lot of skepticism about the U.S. influence over Israel. And by the way, let me add something to what Thomas has said about pauses versus ceasefire. One of the reasons I think the U.S. also is not pushing for a ceasefire, not only because Israel is not willing to accept, is that because they know it might not hold. And there are political implications to pushing for a ceasefire that eventually does not hold. Pauses is something else. You can maybe, even if it doesn't hold, it doesn't have the same kind of political implication internationally, regionally, as a ceasefire after it has been negotiated and struck. So I think the region is looking with skepticism. But again, you have to say that a lot of the allies or partners of the United States in the region are trying as much as possible to navigate between a public opinion that is enraged, right, about what they are seeing on their TV screens, and between their interests of maintaining security interests with the United States, security interest, economic interest with the United States, but also security interests with Israel. I mean, only Bahrain parliament has called now for the expulsion of the Israeli ambassador from Bahrain. Bahrain is one of the signatories to the Abraham Accords. We have not seen other countries doing that. Jordan Jordan has asked the Israeli ambassador to leave. He has already left, in fact, earlier. Recalled its own ambassador from Israel. Egypt has yet to do that. Emirates, United Arab Emirates has yet to do that. So these countries are trying to navigate a very thin line between, appeasing a very angry, enraged public opinion and keeping, their relationship with the United States, but also with Israel, still, viable.
So Rhonda, just to stay with you for a follow-up there, the ambulance incident, going back to this unspecified red line you say that Hezbollah has drawn with the speech today in terms of what happens in Gaza. The Gaza City is encircled. There's been talk about, the key hospitals being used to harbor Hamas organizers, so this makes it a possible target. And now this, how do moments like this intersect with what Nasrallah said today in terms of what Hezbollah is willing to tolerate before it escalates?
I think it looks like their threshold is pretty high. I think they left all the options open. They are ready to intervene. But by saying this is totally a Palestinian operation, I think they are waiting until basically Hamas says, we cannot sustain it. We cannot stay in the fight. This is about to eradicate us. I think this is where. And then he said, already we are doing enough to divert Israeli resources away from the fight with Hamas in Gaza. And so they said, he said, we are doing our share. There is a front. It is not apparent, as it is, in the case of Gaza, but there is a front and we are doing our share. And they have lost more than 50 fighters already. And so I think their threat, but still, the fact that he said it's a Palestinian fight, right. I think the party that's going to determine escalation eventually is going to be Hamas.
Okay, that's interesting. So Tamar, just on the issue of ceasefire, humanitarian pauses, all of the diplomatic dance on that with the humanitarian crisis unfolding in the background. How do you make progress on those issues when you've got one of the leaders of Hamas going on television in Beirut saying, we'll do what we did on October 7th, there will be an October 11th, there will be an October 1,000,000th, we'll do it again and again and again, while saying there should be a ceasefire? You know what I mean? Like, how does Israel can't possibly move when Hamas's leadership is saying things like this publicly?
No, absolutely, and that particular interview by one of the leaders of Hamas is not helpful, and that's a bit of a strange understatement to say, but. Right now, and I said that 3 minutes ago, and I'd really emphasize that, the political space in Israel is not towards a ceasefire. It is not towards negotiations. And who knows how this is going to evolve, but I certainly don't expect that to change significantly in the short term. And there's two different tracks going on. Netanyahu is extremely contested, and the more this goes on, the more I'm skeptical that he survives politically after this ends, because he is so contested as he was before, but much more now. But right now, on the right, on the center, and to some extent on the left in Israel, the consensus is no ceasefire, because a ceasefire is perceived as providing a victory to Hamas and ensuring that this will happen again and again in the future. We may agree or disagree with that outside of Israel, but that's the view in Israel. And speeches like that one, or the interview like the one by the Hamas leader recently, and several other statements only serve to reinforce that dynamic and therefore prolong the possibility of a ceasefire.
So Rhonda Saleem, just as a final point, we don't appear to be any closer to any kind of a resolution in this conflict. But we also don't necessarily seem to be closer to escalation today, based on your analysis of Hezbollah. Is that a fair assessment of where we might be?
Not the kind of escalation that will involve many, multi-front attacks on each other's capital. But already also in the speech today by Nasrallah, in fact, there was a clear reference to a potential escalation by militias in Iraq, in Syria, and the Houthis in Yemen. So I think we might see more of what we have been seeing in terms of attacks, especially on U.S. targets in Syria and Iraq from these actors, as well as maybe on Israel. But in terms of the Lebanon-Israel border, which is viewed as being the most dangerous one that can trigger a major regional war, I think the current escalatory spiral of tit for tat between the two parties, Israel and Hezbollah, is likely to remain in place. And as Nasrallah said, any escalation by Israel will be met by a proportional escalation by Hezbollah.
Rhonda Sleem and Thomas Junot, thank you so much. We always appreciate your time.